Your private property ends where my authority begins, Mr. Barnes. That gate is a violation, and now it's scrap metal. You'll be billed for the removal. The voice, a grating mix of saccharine condescension and rusted steel, belonged to Karen Miller, president of the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association. She stood there, a formidable woman in her late 50s, clad in a pastel pink tracksuit that strained at the seams, her arms crossed over her chest like a monarch passing judgment. Behind her, a hired contractor with a plasma cutter was slicing through the last hinge of my custom-built wrought iron gate, the one I'd installed myself after 25 years as an Army combat engineer. The shriek of superheated metal was a physical pain in my gut, each spark a tiny death for the peace I had fought so hard, in so many godforsaken places, to finally secure for my family. My hand resting on the doorframe of my workshop trembled with a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice water flooding my veins. I could feel the familiar methodical calm descending, the one that always came before the storm, the one that let me calculate trajectories and tolerances under fire. In my mind, I saw the locked steel cabinet just 10 feet away. I saw the key. I saw the Colt M1911, cleaned and oiled. I saw the satisfying, solid weight of a full magazine sliding home with a definitive click. It was a dark, fleeting thought, an echo from a past I had tried to leave behind. But her smug, triumphant smile as my gate crashed to the ground made it feel terrifyingly present. I had built that gate to keep the world out, but the worst part of the world, it turned out, was already inside, wearing a visor and driving a golf cart. This is the moment my war at home began. If you've ever felt trapped by a petty tyrant with a clipboard, if you've ever had your own personal slice of hell delivered by an HOA, then subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I want to hear your stories too, so drop a comment down below and let me know where you're watching from and what HOA nightmare you've survived. Now let me tell you how a fight over a gate turned into a full-blown operation and how the last people Karen Miller ever expected to see showed up to finish it. It all started 6 months earlier with the purchase of what was supposed to be our forever home. After retiring from the service, my wife Sarah and I poured our life savings into a 5-acre plot at the very back of the Oak Creek Meadows development. It was perfect, wooded, secluded, with a long private driveway that separated us from the cookie-cutter houses closer to the entrance. Our son David, a Navy SEAL, was on a long and dangerous deployment, and our only wish was to create a sanctuary for him, a quiet place where he could decompress and feel safe when he finally came home. The gate was a key part of that. It wasn't about snobbery, it was about security and solitude. Before we even poured the concrete for the support columns, I did my due diligence. I submitted plans, drawings, and material specs to the HOA Architectural Review Committee at the time. I received a signed and stamped letter of approval. I kept that letter in a fireproof safe with my discharge papers and our marriage certificate. It was ironclad. For the first year, things were quiet. We settled in, I built my workshop. Sarah planted a garden that would have made her grandmother proud. Then the previous HOA president, a reasonable retired accountant, moved away to be closer to his grandkids. An election was held, and with the apathy typical of most HOAs, only a handful of people voted. Karen Miller, a longtime resident with a well-known penchant for gossip and control, won by a landslide of 6 votes, and that's when the notices started appearing. The first was a thin, white envelope taped to our new mailbox, its presence an omen. It was a formal warning, typed in an aggressive font, stating that our mailbox flag, a small decorative metal eagle I'd attached, was not a pre-approved color. The approved colors were red or black. Mine was antique bronze. The violation carried a potential fine of $25 per day. I read the notice, looked at the eagle, a gift from my old unit, and felt a flicker of annoyance. It was absurd, but I was new here. I wanted to be a good neighbor. I detached the eagle and put it on a shelf in my workshop. A week later, another envelope. This one cited the species of tree we'd planted near the road. The HOA covenants, she wrote, clearly stipulated that only native oak or maple trees were permitted for aesthetic continuity. Our 2 young cherry trees, planted in memory of Sarah's parents, were a violation. This time, the fine was $50 a day. I wrote a polite letter back, explaining their significance and pointing out that they were 30 feet from the road on our private property, invisible for most of the year. Her reply was a cold, formal letter stating that sentimentality does not supersede covenants. The fines began to accrue. The battle lines were being drawn, not over principles of community and property values, but over one woman's insatiable need for power. The gate, my beautiful, sturdy gate, was her ultimate target. It was a symbol of my independence, a clear demarcation of where my property began and her kingdom ended. To her, it was an intolerable act of defiance. One afternoon, she rolled up our driveway in her golf cart, which she'd adorned with a ridiculous flashing yellow light, as if she were some kind of pint-sized emergency vehicle. She didn't get out, just sat there, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Barnes," she began, not waiting for a greeting, "I'm here to inform you that your gate is in gross violation of Section 14, subsection B of the community bylaws. Unauthorized security structures are strictly prohibited." I walked down to meet her, holding my copy of the approval letter. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice even, "I have written approval from the previous board. It's all in order." She waved a dismissive hand, the gesture so arrogant it made my teeth ache. "That board was dissolved. Their decisions are null and void. I am the new authority, and I am revoking that approval." That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a coup. She was erasing the past and rewriting the rules to suit her own agenda. I told her, as calmly as I could, that a legally binding approval couldn't be retroactively voided. I told her the gate was staying. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "We'll see about that," she said, before putting the golf cart in reverse and zipping away. 2 weeks later, the first certified letter arrived, demanding the immediate removal of the gate and levying a fine of $500 plus a new daily fine of $100 until we complied. The war had officially been declared. The certified letters became a weekly ritual of harassment, each one more demanding than the last. Karen Miller had clearly weaponized the U.S. Postal Service, turning it into her personal carrier of bureaucratic venom. The fines escalated with a kind of vindictive creativity I'd never seen before, not even in the most elaborate after-action reports. There was the initial $500 for the gate's existence, the $100 daily noncompliance fee, and then new, smaller fines started to appear, like barnacles on a sinking ship. A $50 fine for improperly maintained landscaping around the gate columns, because a single weed had dared to sprout through the gravel. A $75 fine for the unapproved finish on the wrought iron, which she claimed was too glossy and created a solar glare nuisance. A claim so patently absurd it would have been laughable if it didn't come with a threat of a lien on my home. My wife, Sarah, grew more anxious with each delivery. She would watch for the mail truck, her shoulders tensing as it approached our drive. "Another one, Frank?" she'd ask, her voice small. I tried to shield her from it, but the stress was a toxic fog seeping under the doors. For me, the anger was slowly being forged into something cold and hard. Resolve. I was a combat engineer. I built things, and I solved complex problems under extreme pressure. This was just another problem, a fleshy, pastel-clad, power-mad problem. I went to the office supply store and bought the largest, most durable 3-ring binder I could find. It was heavy-duty, black, with reinforced edges. I labeled the spine in neat block letters, HOA-KM. Inside, I began my own dossier. Every letter she sent was slipped into a plastic sleeve. I made copies of every check I mailed. I paid the initial, smaller fines under protest, writing "paid under protest, all rights reserved" in the memo line. A small act of defiance, my lawyer friend later told me, was a smart move. I printed every email. I took daily, time-stamped photographs of the gate, the mailbox, the cherry trees, the immaculate landscaping, creating a visual log that contradicted every one of her bogus claims. The binder grew thick, a heavy testament to her relentless campaign. I decided to attend the next monthly HOA meeting, thinking a face-to-face appeal to reason in front of the other homeowners might be the answer. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and the faint smell of chlorine from the nearby pool. I arrived early and sat in the back, observing. Karen ran the meeting like a drill sergeant addressing a group of unruly privates. She spoke from a lectern, her voice booming with self-importance as she ran through the agenda. Minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's report, a lengthy and excruciatingly detailed discussion about the new pet waste disposal stations. I watched the faces of my neighbors. Most looked bored, resigned. A few, however, looked intimidated. I saw an elderly woman flinch when Karen mentioned a new crackdown on unapproved garden ornamentation. When the floor was open for new business, I stood up. "My name is Frank Barnes, 1220 Oak Creek Lane," I began, my voice steady. "I'd like to address the multiple violation notices and fines I've received concerning the gate at the end of my driveway." Karen's eyes narrowed. She gave a tight, theatrical smile. "Mr. Barnes, we've been corresponding about this, haven't we? I believe the board's position is perfectly clear." "My position is also clear," I said, holding up a copy of my original approval letter. "This is a legally binding document from the previous Architectural Review Committee. It approves the construction, materials, and placement of the gate." I started to walk toward the lectern to show her the document, but she held up a hand, palm out, stopping me in my tracks. "That document is irrelevant," she declared, her voice rising. "As has been explained to you repeatedly, the decisions of the prior, frankly negligent board have been placed under review and, in your case, overturned for the security and aesthetic integrity of our community." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "You can't just unilaterally invalidate a prior approval," I countered, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts. "There's a legal principle called estoppel. The HOA approved it. I spent a significant amount of money in good faith based on that approval. You can't just change your mind." The word estoppel hung in the air. I could see Karen's face flush a deep, angry red. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not with legal terms she didn't understand. "We will not have our time wasted with pseudo-legal nonsense from a disgruntled resident," she snapped, banging a small gavel on the lectern. "Your case is closed. The fines stand. If you refuse to remove the gate, the board will authorize its removal and bill you for the cost, along with placing a lien on your property. Now, is there any other new business? Something that doesn't involve wasting our precious time?" She looked around the room, her gaze a challenge. No one spoke. I stood there for a moment, the letter in my hand feeling useless. I had tried reason. I had tried procedure. She had just publicly humiliated me and made it clear that her power was absolute. As I walked back to my seat, defeated for the moment, I knew this would not be one in a public forum she controlled. This would be one in the trenches. And my binder, my meticulously organized binder of her own words, was going to be my ammunition. The public humiliation at the HOA meeting was a turning point. It clarified the nature of the conflict. This was not a dispute to be resolved through reason or appeals to fairness. This was a war of attrition against a dictator in a miniature kingdom of her own making. My strategy had to change. I was no longer just defending my gate. I was going on the offensive. My first move was to exercise my rights as a homeowner under the state's property code. I drafted a formal, certified letter, learning from my enemy, to the HOA board, officially requesting access to a specific list of documents. The past 5 years of financial statements, all monthly and annual budgets, the minutes from every board meeting, a full record of all contracts entered into by the HOA, and, most importantly, the complete record of violation notices and fines levied against all residents during Karen's tenure as president. I knew she would resist. Bureaucrats like her thrive on secrecy and selective enforcement. A full, transparent accounting of their actions is like sunlight to a vampire. For weeks, I heard nothing. I sent a second certified letter, this time citing the specific state statute that mandated the HOA provide these documents within 14 business days and noting the civil penalties for noncompliance. The silence continued. This was her next move. Stonewalling, burying me in procedural delays, hoping I would simply give up out of frustration or financial exhaustion from the mounting fines. But she had misjudged her opponent. I didn't get frustrated, I got methodical. While I waited for her to either comply or break the law, I started my own reconnaissance. I began taking walks around the neighborhood in the early evenings, not just for exercise but for observation. I carried a small notepad. I wasn't looking for violations. I was looking for patterns. I noted the houses that were in pristine, almost sterile condition, and I noted the ones that had the subtle signs of life: a basketball hoop slightly askew, a small plastic slide in the backyard, a decorative flag for a college football team. I began to notice a correlation. The violations Karen seemed to obsess over were almost always aimed at families with children, or younger couples, or anyone who didn't fit the mold of a quiet, compliant retiree. The unofficial rules were clearly different for her friends. The former treasurer of the board, a man named Stan, who was one of Karen's cronies, had a massive, non-compliant satellite dish on his roof, a clear violation of the very bylaws she quoted at me. It had been there for years. I took a photograph. Her secretary had a bright pink flamingo in her yard, a direct violation of the garden ornamentation rules she'd used to terrorize the elderly woman at the meeting. I took another photograph. My dossier was expanding beyond my own grievances. It was becoming a chronicle of hypocrisy. It was on one of these walks that I found my first true ally. Her name was Margaret, a widow in her late 70s who lived 3 streets over. I saw her in her front yard, sadly packing a collection of ceramic garden gnomes into a cardboard box. I'd seen them before. They were a whimsical, cheerful little bunch. "Packing up the team?" I asked gently. She looked up, her eyes sad. "Got my final notice from Karen," she sighed. $100 a day if they're not gone by Friday. She called them tacky and detrimental to the neighborhood's upscale character. We got to talking. Margaret had lived in Oak Creek Meadows for 30 years, long before it even had an HOA. She remembered when Karen Miller first moved in, how she immediately started complaining about neighbors' trash cans and the noise from children playing. She'd seen Karen's slow, methodical climb to power, first on the social committee, then the architectural review board, and finally the presidency. "She feeds on this," Margaret said, placing a gnome with a fishing rod carefully into the box. "It's not about the rules. It's about making people feel small. It makes her feel big." I told her about my gate, about the letters, about the meeting. She nodded, unsurprised. "She targets people she thinks won't fight back," Margaret said, "or people she thinks are a threat. Your gate, Frank, that's a threat. It's you telling her where her power ends. She can't stand that." Before I left, Margaret gave me a crucial piece of information. She told me about a contractor the HOA had used for years for landscaping and minor repairs. The owner was Karen's brother-in-law. She mentioned that the contracts always seemed to be for much higher amounts than expected, and the work was often shoddy. "Nobody ever questioned it," she said. "It's easier to just pay the dues and stay quiet." I went home that evening with a new section for my binder: potential financial impropriety. The game was changing. It was no longer just about my gate. It was about a pattern of abuse, selective enforcement, and potential corruption. Karen's stonewalling on the financial documents suddenly made a lot more sense. She wasn't just hiding pettiness. She was likely hiding graft. My quiet investigation had just hit a main nerve, and I knew I had to push harder. The wall of silence from Karen and the board was a calculated risk on her part, but a foolish one. She assumed I was just one angry homeowner who would eventually run out of steam. What she didn't know was that my entire military career was built on logistics, planning, and grinding down objectives through relentless, sustained pressure. I wasn't going anywhere. Realizing that my formal requests were being ignored, I knew it was time to bring in professional support. I reached out to an old friend from my Army days, a man named Tom Riley. Tom had been a JAG officer, a military lawyer, and after retiring, he'd opened a small private practice specializing in civil litigation. He was sharp, pragmatic, and had a deep-seated intolerance for bullies. I met him at his office, a modest place with walls covered in framed commendations and photos of his kids. I didn't bring my whole binder, just a summary and the key documents: the original gate approval, the first violation notice, and my unanswered formal request for HOA records. I laid them out on his conference table. Tom read through them in silence, his expression growing more grim with each page. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen on the table. "Frank," he said, his voice low and serious, "you've walked into the classic HOA buzzsaw. This woman, Karen, she's a textbook petty tyrant. They get a little taste of power and it becomes their entire identity. They wrap themselves in the bylaws like a flag and dare anyone to challenge them. So what are my options? I asked. Legally, she's on shaky ground across the board, Tom explained. Voiding a prior approval like that is highly contestable. The selective enforcement you've documented is a huge liability for the HOA, and ignoring your official request for records is a clear violation of state law. We can sue. We can file for an injunction. We can make a lot of noise. He paused, looking me straight in the eye. But you need to understand, this is a long, expensive, and ugly process. She'll use the HOA's money, your money, to fight you. She'll drag it out, hoping to bleed you dry. We could win, but it might take a year and cost you 20 grand in legal fees. You might never fully recover. It was a sobering assessment, the kind of honest, no BS advice I expected from him. There has to be another way, I said, thinking of Sarah's stress, of the principle of the thing. I'm not just going to roll over. Tom leaned forward, a thoughtful glint in his eye. There might be. Right now, this is a civil matter. It's a contract dispute. It's boring and it's slow. We need to change the venue. We need to make it a criminal matter. My eyebrows shot up. Criminal? Think about it, he said, tapping the letter where Karen threatened to have the gate removed. What is that, really? She's threatening to hire someone to come onto your private property and destroy something you own. That's not a covenant violation. That's willful destruction of property. It's vandalism. It's a crime. A plan began to form, a beautiful, simple, and elegant trap. Tom laid it out. She's already made the threat in writing. That's evidence of intent. Right now, it's just a threat. We need her to act on it. We need her to cross that line in a way that is undeniable and, most importantly, provable. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. We would let her make the next move. We wouldn't take down the gate. We would wait for her to follow through on her threat. But when she did, we would be ready. First, Tom instructed, you're going to install cameras, not obvious ones. Get good quality, covert cameras with audio recording capabilities. Aim one at the gate from the house, maybe another one hidden in a tree or a birdhouse nearby. We need crystal clear footage of who does it and who is directing them. Second, he continued, you're going to send one more letter to the entire HOA board, not just Karen. Certified mail, return receipt. In it, you will state calmly and professionally that the gate was installed with prior approval, that you consider it your private property, and that any attempt by any individual or contractor acting on behalf of the HOA to damage or remove it will be considered a criminal act of vandalism and will be immediately reported to the county sheriff's department. You will quote the specific state statute for destruction of property. This puts the entire board on notice. They can no longer claim ignorance or that Karen was acting alone. Third, he concluded, you wait. You document everything. And the moment they touch that gate, you don't call me. You call 911. You report a crime in progress. I left Tom's office feeling a surge of adrenaline, the kind I hadn't felt in years. The feeling of having a solid operational plan. The binder was my intelligence. Tom was my legal firepower. And now we had a strategy. We weren't going to fight her on her turf anymore. We were going to lure her onto mine, and the law would be waiting for her. That night, I ordered 4 state-of-the-art, motion-activated night vision security cameras. I spent the next weekend installing them, hiding them so perfectly that even I had trouble spotting them afterward. I drafted the letter with Tom's help and sent it to Karen and every single board member. The trap was baited. All I had to do now was wait for the Queen to move her piece into check. The letter putting the board on notice had an immediate, albeit subtle effect. The weekly violation notices stopped. It was an unnerving silence, the kind of quiet that precedes an ambush. Karen was clearly regrouping, likely consulting with the HOA's own legal counsel, who must have advised her that my letter had raised the stakes considerably. But I knew her pride and her obsession with control wouldn't let her back down. She was just looking for a new angle of attack. In the meantime, the story of my confrontation at the HOA meeting and my subsequent formal actions began to circulate through the neighborhood. It started as whispers over fences and quiet conversations during evening walks. Then it grew bolder. My first visitor was a young man named Ben, who lived in one of the newer sections. He was a firefighter with 2 young kids. He knocked on my door one Saturday morning, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Barnes?" he asked. "I heard about what you're doing. I I just wanted to say thank you." He told me about his own battle with Karen. She had fined him repeatedly because his children's plastic playhouse in the backyard was visible for a few feet over the top of his privacy fence. He'd received letters threatening him with fines of $50 a day for the unapproved permanent structure. He finally took it down, but the experience had left him feeling angry and powerless. "She made my kids cry," he said, his jaw tight. "She told them their toy was an eyesore." His story was infuriating. I invited him in, and over a cup of coffee, I showed him my binder. His eyes widened as he saw the sheer volume of correspondence, the photographs, the meticulous records. "This is incredible," he breathed. "You're treating it like an operation." "It is an operation," I replied. Ben was just the first. A few days later, a couple who had lived in Oak Creek for 10 years stopped me while I was getting the mail. They had been cited for having a small vegetable garden in their backyard, which Karen had deemed a violation because it wasn't exclusively ornamental. They were forced to rip out their tomato and cucumber plants. The stories kept coming, a slow trickle at first, then a steady stream. A family fined because their teenager's car, a perfectly maintained 20-year-old sedan, was deemed not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of the community. A woman ordered to remove a wreath from her door because it was 2 days after the approved seasonal decoration period. Each story was another piece of the puzzle, another entry in the pattern of abuse section of my binder. It was clear that Karen's reign was not just about enforcing rules. It was about wielding power to bully, intimidate, and harass anyone who didn't conform to her narrow, sterile vision of a perfect neighborhood. I realized I couldn't fight this alone, nor should I. This wasn't just my fight. I decided to organize a meeting, but not an official HOA meeting in her clubhouse. This would be a gathering of the resistance. I spoke with Ben, Margaret, and a few others who had shared their stories. We spread the word quietly, neighbor to neighbor. We held the meeting on a Thursday evening in my large workshop, a neutral space far from Karen's watchful eyes. I set up folding chairs and Sarah made coffee and cookies. I expected maybe 10 or 15 people. Over 40 showed up. They filled the workshop, standing along the walls and spilling out into the driveway. The mood was a mixture of anger, frustration, and a palpable sense of relief at not being alone. I stood before them, my binder on a workbench, and I told them my story from the beginning. Then I opened the floor. For the next 2 hours, people stood up, one by one, and shared their experiences. The sheer scale of Karen's petty tyranny was staggering. We heard from a retired nurse who was fined because the ambulance that came for her husband, who was having a heart attack, had left tire marks on the curb. We heard from a young mother who was reprimanded for using unapproved chalk colors when her daughter drew on their own driveway. As people spoke, a powerful transformation occurred. The fear and isolation that Karen had cultivated for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and collective strength. We weren't just a collection of disgruntled residents anymore. We were a community united against a common oppressor. By the end of the meeting, we had formed a concerned homeowners committee of Oak Creek Meadows. We elected a steering group with me as the chair. We pooled our resources to create a small legal fund. We started a private social media group to share information and evidence. My binder was no longer just my personal file. It became our central intelligence repository. We were organized, we were funded, and we were legion. The balance of power in Oak Creek Meadows had just begun to shift dramatically. Karen Miller thought she was fighting one stubborn veteran. She was about to find out she had declared war on her entire community. The formation of our committee sent a shockwave through the HOA. We knew Karen would hear about it, and we wanted her to. The days of her operating in the shadows, picking off residents one by one, were over. Our first official act as a committee was to draft a formal letter of grievance, signed by over 50 households detailing the pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and a demand for a special meeting to discuss a vote of no confidence in her presidency. We sent it to the entire board, again, via certified mail. This was a direct challenge to her authority, a public declaration that she had lost the consent of the governed. While she was reeling from that, my personal battlefront was about to get a major injection of motivation. I received an email from my son, David. It was short and to the point, as his messages always were from deployment. The subject line was just, "Coming home." He and his SEAL team were finishing their tour. He'd be stateside in 3 weeks. The news was a jolt of pure joy, cutting through all the stress and anger of the past few months. Sarah and I immediately began planning. We wanted to do something special, a huge surprise welcome home party. David was a quiet, humble guy. He wouldn't want a big public fuss, but a gathering of family, close friends, and his teammates at our home, his sanctuary, would be perfect. The party became our focus. It was a light at the end of the tunnel, but it also raised the stakes of my fight with Karen to an entirely new level. The gate, the privacy, the peace of our home, it was all for him. The idea of his homecoming being marred by this ugly conflict, of him returning from a war zone only to find another one in his own front yard, was unbearable. It solidified my resolve. This had to be finished, and finished decisively, before he got home. I decided it was time to force Karen's hand. The trap had been baited for weeks, but she hadn't taken it. My letter warning her off had made her cautious. I needed to present her with a challenge so direct, so insulting to her authority, that she couldn't resist. I needed to rebuild the gate. I spent a week on it. I didn't just repair the old one. I forged a new one. It was similar in design, but heavier, thicker, reinforced with steel plates at the hinges and lock mechanism. I welded it myself in my workshop, the bright arc of the welder a focal point for all my frustration. It was more than a gate, it was a fortress door. When it was finished, Ben and a few other guys from the committee came over to help me install it. We set it on new, deeper concrete footings. We used hardened steel bolts. It was a statement. As we tightened the final bolt, I stood back and admired our work. It looked magnificent, a defiant symbol of property and privacy. My next step was to inform the board. I didn't ask for permission. I sent them a notice of repair and reinstallation. In the letter, I stated that as they had failed to produce any legitimate documentation invalidating my original approval, and as I had a responsibility to secure my property, I had reinstalled the gate. I reiterated in no uncertain terms that my property was now under 24/7 high-definition video and audio surveillance, and that any unauthorized person attempting to tamper with or remove the gate would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for criminal trespass and felony destruction of property. I attached a bill for the cost of the new gate over $5,000 to the notice, stating that I would be deducting the amount from my future HOA dues until it was paid in full, citing the damages incurred from the HOA's unlawful actions. It was a declaration of war. I had thrown down the gauntlet in the most aggressive way I could imagine. There was no way Karen Miller's ego could let this stand. She would have to act. And my cameras, silently watching, would be waiting for her. The countdown to David's homecoming had begun, and with it, the countdown to Karen's final, self-inflicted downfall. The new gate stood for exactly 8 days. For 8 days, it was a silent, black iron monument to defiance at the end of my driveway. I could feel Karen's rage from a quarter-mile away. Her golf cart patrols became more frequent, her circuits taking her past my property line multiple times a day. She would slow down, glaring at the gate, her face a mask of incandescent fury. My cameras captured every pass, every scowl. The footage was almost comical, like watching a petty dictator surveying the one corner of her empire she couldn't conquer. In the meantime, our committee was applying pressure on other fronts. We had formally petitioned for the special meeting, and after consulting with the HOA's lawyer, the other board members, clearly getting nervous about their own liability, had agreed to schedule it. The tide was turning, but I knew Karen wouldn't be defeated in a boardroom. Her entire identity was tied up in her power. To lose it would be a kind of death for her. She was going to lash out, and she was going to do it her way, with brute force. The moment came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week before David was due to arrive. The day was bright and clear. I was in my workshop, oiling a piece of equipment, when my phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera app, motion detected at the gate. I pulled up the live feed. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat of anticipation. There it was. A large flatbed truck with a winch and cutting equipment was parked on the road. The same contractor from before, a burly man who looked like he wrestled bears for a living, was unloading his tools. And standing there, directing him with imperious waves of her hand, was Karen. She was wearing a bright yellow tracksuit today, making her impossible to miss. A furious, oversized canary directing a demolition. She was so blinded by her rage, so confident in her authority, that she had walked right into the kill zone. I turned up the volume on the feed. The audio was crystal clear, the hidden microphone picking up everything. "I want it gone, Jim," Karen was saying, her voice sharp and brittle. "Not just taken down. I want it cut into pieces. Unsalvageable. I want him to understand what happens when you defy this board." "You sure about this, Karen?" the contractor Jim asked, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "He sent that letter, talking about the sheriff and all that." "Don't you worry about that," she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "His letters mean nothing. I am the law in this neighborhood. I have the authority of the covenants. His son's hero status doesn't give him a right to defy me. Now get to work. We're paying you by the hour." It was perfect. Better than I could have scripted. A confession, a conspiracy to commit a crime, and a clear dismissal of a legal warning, all captured in high-definition video and audio. She had just handed me the case, gift-wrapped. I let them work for a few minutes. I wanted the crime to be fully in progress. I watched on my phone as Jim fired up his plasma cutter, the brilliant, terrible blue-white light searing across the screen. The shriek of metal being destroyed echoed a second time, but this time, it wasn't a sound of defeat. It was the sound of my trap springing shut. I picked up my phone. I didn't call Tom. I didn't run outside to confront them. I calmly dialed 911. "Yes," I said to the dispatcher, my voice steady. "I'd like to report a crime in progress. It's felony destruction of property. My address is 1220 Oak Creek Lane. Yes, they're here right now. The person who hired him is on site, directing the crime. Her name is Karen Miller. And yes, ma'am, I have the entire incident on a live video feed." I gave the dispatcher a brief, concise summary. She was professional, efficient. She told me deputies were being dispatched immediately. I hung up the phone and opened a second app, the one that gave me access to the camera I had placed further down the road, watching the entrance to the neighborhood. I settled in to watch the final act. It took less than 10 minutes. On the screen, I saw two county sheriff's patrol cars turn onto our street, their movements swift and purposeful. They didn't use their sirens, approaching quietly. They pulled up behind the contractor's truck, blocking it in. I watched on the main camera feed as two deputies got out of their cars. They were tall, professional, and had the unhurried calm of men who were completely in control of the situation. Karen and Jim were so focused on their work, they didn't notice until the first deputy was 10 feet away. "Ma'am, sir," the deputy said, his voice polite but firm, "could you please turn off the equipment? We need to have a word." The trap was sprung. The predator was caught, and she had no idea the jaws were even closing. The arrival of the sheriff's deputies was a moment of beautiful, cinematic clarity. Karen, who had been barking orders at the contractor, spun around, her face a mixture of shock and indignation. She saw the uniforms, the gleaming badges, the patrol cars blocking the road, and her first instinct was not fear, but arrogance. She clearly assumed they were there for me, that I had perhaps called them to complain, and that she, as the figure of authority, would quickly set them straight. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she began, striding toward them with her clipboard held out like a scepter. "This resident, Mr. Barnes, has been a continual problem. This structure," she said, gesturing dramatically at my half-dismembered gate, "is an illegal installation, and we are simply enforcing the community covenants." The first deputy, a man with a weathered face and a calm, patient demeanor, simply looked at her. He didn't look at her clipboard. He looked at her. "Ma'am, we received a call from the property owner reporting the active destruction of his private property. Are you in charge here?" "I am Karen Miller. President of the Oak Creek Meadows, HOA, she announced, as if the title granted her diplomatic immunity. And yes, I authorized this removal. The HOA is fully within its rights. Did you see the no trespassing sign posted right there? The deputy asked, pointing to the sign on the remaining gatepost. And were you aware that Mr. Barnes had formally notified you in writing that he would consider this action a criminal offense? Karen's face began to lose its confident smirk. A flicker of uncertainty appeared in her eyes. That's a civil matter, she stammered. It has nothing to do with you. Ma'am, the second deputy chimed in, stepping forward. He was younger, but his voice was pure steel. When you hire a man with a cutting torch to destroy another person's property, it stops being a civil matter. Right now, it looks a lot like felony vandalism. We'd like to see your copy of the court order authorizing this removal. Court order? She scoffed, though her voice was a little higher now. I don't need a court order. I have the bylaws. It was at that moment that I chose to make my entrance. I walked calmly down my driveway, my phone in my hand, the video feed still recording. I stopped a respectful distance from the deputies. Officers, I said clearly, I'm Frank Barnes, the homeowner. This woman, Karen Miller, and the man she hired were notified in writing that this action would be considered a crime. I have video and audio of the entire event, including Ms. Miller ordering him to destroy my property. I held up my phone and showed the lead deputy the footage. He watched for a moment, his expression unreadable. He looked at Karen, then at the contractor, who now looked terrified, then back at the phone. He nodded slowly. Ma'am, he said to Karen, his voice losing all its previous patience, you're going to have to come with us. The color drained from Karen's face. What? You're arresting me? This is ridiculous. I am the president, she shrieked, her voice cracking. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, were starting to gather at the ends of their driveways, watching the drama unfold. Karen's public humiliation, the very tool she had used against so many others, was now being turned on her. It was at this precise moment of peak chaos, Karen screeching, the deputies looking exasperated, the contractor trying to become invisible, that a new sound intruded. It was the low rumble of multiple vehicles approaching. I looked up the street. A convoy of 3 black, civilian-model SUVs and a heavy-duty pickup truck was coming down the lane. They moved with a kind of quiet, disciplined purpose that was instantly familiar to me. My heart leaped into my throat. It was them. David. They were early. The convoy pulled to a stop behind the patrol cars. The doors opened and 7 men got out. They were all in their late 20s or early 30s, dressed in jeans and t-shirts. But they moved with an economy of motion and a quiet, watchful intensity that set them apart. They were all lean, muscular, and had the focused, unwavering eyes of men who had seen things the rest of us could only imagine. They were David's SEAL team. My son David was the last one out of the lead vehicle. He was taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders. He saw me, and a huge grin broke across his face. Then his eyes took in the scene. He saw the flashing lights of the patrol cars. He saw the ruined gate, his mother's welcome home project, lying in pieces. He saw a hysterical woman in a yellow tracksuit being spoken to by sheriff's deputies. He saw the neighbors watching. His grin vanished, replaced by a look of cold, hard fury. He walked toward me, his team fanning out silently behind him, a formidable, unspoken wall of support. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the gate, then at Karen, then back at me, one eyebrow raised in a question. I just nodded grimly. The deputies watched the silent, intimidating arrival of these men with wary curiosity. Karen, in her panicked state, seemed to finally realize she was no longer the most powerful person on the street. She was just a hysterical woman in a yellow tracksuit, surrounded by the law, her victim, and a team of elite warriors who had just come home from a war to find their brother's home under attack. The cavalry hadn't just arrived. They were SEAL Team 6. The arrival of David and his team changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The energy on the street shifted from a local dispute to something far more serious and profound. These 7 men, fresh from a world of real conflict and genuine threats, stood in stark silence. Their collective presence a heavy, unspoken judgment on the petty tyranny that was unfolding. They didn't have to say a word. Their quiet, disciplined observation was more intimidating than any shouting could ever be. David walked over to me, ignoring everyone else, and gave me a hard, one-armed hug. "Dad," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What the hell is this?" I clapped him on the shoulder, my throat tight with emotion. "Welcome home, son. This is the HOA president, Karen Miller. She had some objections to our gate." David's eyes, cold as chips of granite, settled on Karen. She visibly flinched under his gaze. The deputies, sensing the situation could escalate in an unexpected direction, took control. "All right, ma'am," the lead deputy said to Karen, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are being detained on suspicion of felony destruction of property and conspiracy. Please put your hands behind your back." Karen's face crumpled. The last vestiges of her authority evaporated, replaced by a raw, pathetic panic. "No, you can't. I have rights," she wailed as the deputy expertly cuffed her. The clicking sound of the handcuffs was loud and final in the sudden silence. As she was being led to the patrol car, still protesting her innocence and babbling about bylaws, the contractor, Jim, approached the deputies, his hands raised in surrender. "Look, I was just doing my job," he pleaded. "She hired me. She showed me a work order." The deputy pointed him toward the other patrol car. "You can explain that downtown. For now, you're being detained as well." The whole scene was surreal. Neighbors were now openly recording on their phones. My allies from the committee, Ben and Margaret and others, were watching with expressions of stunned vindication. In the midst of it all, Sarah ran out of the house, having heard the sirens and seen the commotion. She saw David, and all the chaos faded away for her. They embraced in a long, emotional hug right there in the driveway, a pocket of pure love in the middle of the wreckage. With Karen secured in the back of a patrol car, the lead deputy came over to me. "Mr. Barnes, we'll need a formal statement from you, and a copy of that video evidence will be crucial. Can you come down to the station this afternoon?" "Absolutely, officer," I said. "Thank you." "No, thank you for your service," he said, nodding respectfully toward David and his team, who were now quietly surveying the damage to the gate. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. As the patrol cars pulled away, taking a cuffed and weeping Karen Miller with them, a spontaneous cheer went up from the assembled neighbors. It was a sound of liberation. The reign of terror was officially over. David finally turned his full attention to the gate. He ran a hand over a piece of twisted, scorched metal. His teammates gathered around, their faces grim. These were men who understood structural integrity, demolition, and fortification better than anyone. They looked at the destroyed gate not as a handyman project, but as a breach defense. "Combat engineers, huh?" One of them, a guy built like a refrigerator named Mac, said to me with a wry grin. "Looks like you've got some work to do, Frank." "We can give you a hand," another one offered. Before I could even respond, they were in motion. It was incredible to watch. They worked with an unspoken coordination that was both fascinating and deeply impressive. David took charge, directing them like it was a small unit operation. They cleared the debris from the driveway. Mac and another SEAL went to their truck and came back with heavy-duty chains and a come-along. They assessed the two main posts, which were still standing, and began discussing the best way to rig a temporary but secure barrier. Within an hour, they had cleared the wreckage, straightened a bent post using the truck's winch, and fashioned a temporary gate from the least damaged sections, securing it with a hardened chain and a massive padlock that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. They weren't just helping a teammate's dad, they were restoring a perimeter. It was a symbolic act of reclaiming the space, of rebuilding what had been torn down. The homecoming party that evening was transformed. It was no longer just a celebration of David's return, but a victory party for the entire neighborhood. People brought over covered dishes, salads, and desserts. Ben, the firefighter, brought a cooler of beer. Margaret brought her famous lemon meringue pie. My workshop and backyard were filled with a joyful, triumphant crowd. David's team members, initially reserved, soon relaxed, sharing stories, the non-classified ones at least, and laughing with my neighbors. They were no longer intimidating warriors. They were just a group of extraordinary young men, happy to be home and happy to see their brother safe and sound. Late in the evening, after most people had gone home, David and I stood by the temporary gate, looking out at the quiet street. "Quite a homecoming, Dad," he said with a small smile. "I'm sorry you had to come home to this, son," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Don't be," he said. "You did what you always taught me to do. You saw a line that couldn't be crossed, and you held it. I've never been prouder." We stood there in the quiet of the night, father and son, the silence comfortable between us. The battle for Oak Creek Meadows was over. We had won. But more importantly, my son was home, and our sanctuary, though scarred, was secure once more. Justice had been served, and the community, broken by fear, was finally beginning to heal.